This is Dan Harrison. Today is December 12, 2011. I'm here with Warren Littlefield for an interview with the Academy of Television Archive, and we're in Burbank, California.
And where if you want to...
What was your name at birth?
Warren Littlefield.
When were you born?
May 11th, 1952.
Where were you born?
Montclair, New Jersey.
What is your father's name?
Walter.
And what did he do?
My dad was a salesman for H.J. Heinz Company. We called him a pickle pusher.
What's your mother's name?
Barbara.
What did she do?
My mom was a housewife, and pretty awesome bowling game as well.
Did you have any siblings?
I do. I have an older sister, Pam, 4 years older than I am.
What activities were you interested in growing up?
Having fun. I wasn't a great student, and I had a tremendous love of television and film. It was not uncommon for me to fake illness and stay home and watch The $1 Million Movie on Channel 9 in New York. I loved the outdoors, hiking, camping. I was big in the scouting program, and I love sports as well. Kind of a all-round suburban kid. Enjoyed my surroundings, enjoyed growing up in suburban New Jersey. New York City was our playground.
What were some of your early favorite shows?
I loved Topper. I thought that was just a wonderful comedy. Leo G. Carroll, I thought, was an amazing lead, and that made me laugh. Cleo, Talking Dog. I don't know, I was a sucker for that. Those are some of my early memories of really early on television.
Do you think any of those early shows influenced what you ultimately developed and put on the air?
I think not in a direct descendant way. I don't know if I could connect the dots, but my love of the medium, my love of great drama, big comedy, absolutely. I always tried to channel what I felt, more so than the concepts, but what they made me feel.
What did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, I ended up with a degree in psychology, but early on, I kind of had a sense that there was this Ed Sullivan-like experience on Sunday night where I thought, that guy has the greatest job in the world. That guy is inviting all these people into his playground, and he's just putting on a show. And I thought that was probably something that if I could ever find myself in any way adjacent to what he was doing, that seemed like that would be, every day would be exciting. That was an early childhood memory that I then suppressed and didn't come back to that memory until I was looking for a job with a psychology degree and scratched my head and said, I'm not sure I want to go to graduate school just yet.
Where did you go to college, and why did you pick psychology as your major?
Well, it was the 70s, I can't say I knew exactly what I was going to do. I wanted a liberal arts background. I actually started school at American University School of Government and Public Administration in Washington, D.C., and I went there for 2 years, and that was exciting. Nixon was in the White House. We spent a lot of time downtown, on the Hill, really kind of understanding how government worked. Pete Rodino was my congressman, and we hung out in Shirley Chisholm's office. And then the May Day demonstrations came, and we got extra credit for demonstrating, and I was guaranteed an A in sociology if I got arrested, and I got the A. So I enjoyed that. It was a good education, but I then really went, I'm not sure I want to go to work for the government. I wasn't sure I wanted to work in international law. I really thought, let's go smaller, let's look inside. So I transferred to a small liberal arts school in New York State, Hobart and William Smith, and that's where I focused on psychology, philosophy, religion, and ultimately got a BS in psychology in 1974 from Hobart and William Smith.
And what was your first job when you finished college?
Well, I interviewed for a number of things in New York, and I just didn't know what I wanted to do. And I walked out of interviews because I said, I know I don't want to do that job. And I went to work for a small independent production company as a gopher. I had known Charlie Mortimer, who started that company. He had a wonderful career in advertising. And his dream in life was to have a little production company. I knew him because I did the junior wing of the Montclair Dramatic Club when I was in high school. And he was our dramatic coach. He's the one who ran that program. And he said, I know you're trying to figure out what you're doing. In the meantime, if you don't know what you're doing, come be a gopher for me. And I jumped into the water doing the new Little Rascals. They were making a pilot. And I went, yeah, this is it. Not the new Little Rascals, but the world of entertainment, and working in production and making television. And then I realized I was in big trouble because I hadn't studied it, and I knew that I was going to have to compete against a lot of people who knew exactly what they were going to do for many, many years. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to sleep for a while. For a long while, I'm going to play catch-up, and I'm going to learn about this business.
What appealed to you specifically about television versus film, or why did you keep pursuing television?
I think television is just something that felt like it was a part of me. I had a television in my room. I had grown up on television, and not that I didn't love going to the movies, but the television felt like it was a part of my immediate family. I reached out to it for news and information and entertainment, and some reason I was just drawn to that. And that first project that was a failed pilot was for television, and somehow I went, okay, well, that one didn't work. I think I know why it didn't work. Let me continue in this.
So how did you move from being a gopher to starting to develop and produce TV specials, TV movies?
Well, I looked at the pipeline at Westfall Productions, and I realized that the only way I was going to stay employed was if there was more things to make. And they didn't seem to have a lot in the pipe. So I just started playing in the world of ideas, saying, well, what about this and what about this? And ultimately, I was able to find a property that was a book called Raising Daisy Rothschild, and it was about saving an endangered species of giraffe in East Africa, and developed that into a television movie. And I was fortunate enough to go produce that in East Africa. I wasn't even 25 years old at the time, but I'd managed to get $1.25 million in the bank, and I got to race off to East Africa to go make a 2-hour movie of the week for CBS. And that was wildly exciting. That was quite an adventure.
And how was that received ultimately?
It was more than a 30 share, which was fine back in those days. No particular critical acclaim, except for the fact where television back then in the mid-'70s was making hundreds, literally network television was making hundreds of MOWs every single year. And the Hollywood Reporter, for some bizarre reason, picked it as one of the top 10 movies of the week that year and singled us out. And I'm still not sure why. But that top 10 and my producing credit and the fact that selling that movie worldwide for Westfall Productions, all of those put us into profits for that company. And that enabled me to go from that little company in New York, and I moved out to California to work for Warner Brothers Television.
Was it directly as a result of your producing The Last Giraffe that Warner Brothers, you were on Warner Brothers' radar?
Well, I think the biggest thing was my boss, Charlie Mortimer, had over the years promoted me. I was there for 4 years. He had promoted me to be a vice president, and he asked me to be president of the company. And I think that, more than anything, made me realize, as much of a compliment as it was, I realized I wasn't ready to be president of anything. And so I ran as fast as I could to California to get a job because I knew I needed more education. And going to work for a company like Warner Brothers, from a little tiny production company in New York, like Westfall Productions, and Warner's hired me as a director of development. On one level, it was a demotion, but I knew I had to follow an educational path. I was still playing catch-up. So for me, it was absolutely the right move, and I continued to grow and learn working there.
What were the key projects that you worked on at Warner Brothers?
Well, I was at Warner Brothers for 6 months. So I worked on nothing particularly notable. We did a comedy for NBC that we pitched called 6 O'Clock Follies, which was really an ensemble comedy about a unit in Vietnam. I don't think America was ready to look back and laugh at that. But I was now working for Warner Brothers Television. I was out selling to other networks, and NBC encouraged me to audition for a development position that was open at NBC in comedy.
So did you have conscious of going from one seller to being a buyer, and was that what made you want to leave Warner's for NBC?
I think I was still in pursuit of the best education. And from everyone that I knew and respected, they just said, if you get in at a junior level at a network, there's so much coming at you that it's a way to accelerate your education of how the business works. Work in program development, work on the air shows, whatever you do at a network, it is a warp speed absorption into the world of television. And that just felt exciting. It felt like a great opportunity. And so I applied for the job at NBC, and that was a manager in comedy development. So I took another step down, although, again, it was a step up in education.
So who hired you at NBC?
I interviewed with Brandon Tartikoff and Michael Zinberg, and Michael was running comedy development, and Brandon was the senior VP of program development.
What was your first impression of Brandon?
He had a dark sense of humor, and it was kind of infectious. Where I thought I had to sit up straight and be proper, he had you know what, we're just going to have a great time, and we're going to do some wild stuff. And that kind of there are no rules attitude, and a gallows humor, because NBC was not doing particularly well. And in the world of comedy, it was a disaster. They had different strokes than Hello Larry. That was it on the air. I was watching episodes of Facts of Life that hadn't gone on yet. They were nowhere in the world of comedy. And my feeling was, well, maybe nowhere to go but up.
What were his expectations, or him and Michael Zinberg's expectations of you and of the comedy area? Was it to radically change the fortunes of?
Well, for me, they wanted me to just come on board, watch, listen, learn. So I was in a great position. I was truly the junior guy on the team. And before long, what we started doing is we were ramping up more and more comedy production. We were in business with Tandem Productions, Norman Lear's company. And so we were starting to actually have some success. And Fred said to them, you better take someone smart who you believe in comedy and get them working on the on-air shows, because, heaven forbid we do something right. We don't want to lose it. And I think that was for me, that was a great educational opportunity. Just go plow in the fields of episodic television. I could grow, I could learn. But then the biggest move was saying NBC, acknowledging they didn't have a brand of comedy. They were still kind of all over the map. And the deal that would change the fortunes of NBC was the deal for the Charles Brothers and Jimmy Burrows, which ultimately, that deal was 13 episodes guaranteed on the air. No one else would make that deal, but no one else was as desperate as NBC. And they brought an adult, smart, sophisticated comedy to NBC. We had none. And it was the game changer. Cheers became a landmark television series for that network, and I got to be the junior development guy on that pilot, and then they asked me to stay with the series. So that really became my learning tree for smart adult comedy.
Before Cheers, what do you think NBC's reputation was within the television community and at large? And, obviously it didn't just take one show to start changing that, but when did you start to see the impact of? Well,
NBC, when I started there at the end of 1979, and we're really talking about the early 80s, NBC was recovering from a big event kind of mentality. Rather than the backbone of NBC being series television, they went through a phase where they were the big event network. And, of course, it's great to have big events, but those are all just to give your series spine a little bit of a break. And no one was really focusing long-term on what is the dramatic content, what is the comedic content for NBC's core schedule. So that was all new. That was all in front of us. NBC, we used to joke, in a 3-network race was number 4. They're just not really in the game. So that allowed us to kind of figure it out. And Cheers on the comedy side became the benchmark for what NBC would do with comedy, and Hill Street Blues on the dramatic side also developed at the comedy department. And I was the junior man on the development of Hill Street Blues, and that was just an incredible education and ride for me. And like Cheers, they asked me to stay and work on that series. And so my 2 Learning Tree shows were Cheers and Hill Street, and I couldn't have had a better education.
Was that the imprint of Brandon? Was it Grant Tinker? Was it both of them? What did they each bring to the mix, and what was your experience working with Grant and with Brandon?
Well, I think those shows were a wonderful blend of what Brandon did best, what Grant did best, and truth be told, also the initial idea for Hill Street started with Fred Silverman saying, "Why don't we do a 1 hour? Why don't we do a 1 hour Barney Miller?" And Stephen Bochco knew what to do with that. No one was ready for what that would ultimately turn out to be. But Brandon knew we just weren't in business at NBC with the quality of producers, the quality of writers that the other guys had been in business with. And so seducing them, bringing them to Burbank, coming to work for NBC, and finding the right ideas, Brandon was great at that.
How did Hill Street come out of the comedy department? Why did that start there? Was it the Barney Miller comparison? Was it?
I think it was a little bit of the Barney Miller. I wasn't there the moment that started. I had just come in after, but Michael Zimberg had a relationship also with Stephen Bochco, and the rules were blurred at the time, I think in a really good way, and it also sent a message that it was going to be an hour-long show, but as dramatic as it might be, there would also be a lot of humor in it. And so there was not, okay, half hours must be in the comedy department and hours over in the drama department. There was competition, and that, of course, became a landmark show for NBC and said to the creative community, here's the kind of television that can go on at this network.
Was that a reflection of Brandon's management style, the healthy competition and the rules?
I think absolutely. Brandon enjoyed chaos. He enjoyed the fun of mixing it up. And he also understood, I think, as a manager, how to have people compete against one another, and in a good way.
After 2 years, you were promoted to vice president, so your career started to go
I was
up.
headed back in the right direction.
Yeah. How did that come about, and what changes did that entail for you professionally with your career at NBC?
Well, I was gaining more. I was certainly getting a better education, and people were looking at me and saying, "Gee, maybe he's going to be around for a little while," and NBC started to get a little bit of a voice and a little bit of success. And my focus then was comedy development as well as the current comedy shows. And they made me a vice president covering both. So they said, we're not going to give you any more money, but we're going to give you the on-the-air comedy and the development. And we have a lot of faith in you. You can do both.
What shows did you develop in that role?
Notably, the biggest, the most successful, of course, was The Cosby Show. And Tom Werner and Marcy Carsey came in. They met with Brandon and myself, and they said, we have an idea to do a family comedy. Bill had played with a number of ideas. Bill Cosby had been thinking about being a limo driver in a 1 hour show. Tom and Marcy convinced Bill that he should play in the family comedy world. And as Marcy would describe it, she said, there's a war going on in the living room. This is about a father who says, I'm not losing that war. And that's a war between parents and teenagers. And that was about all they had. No writers. They had Bill, and they wanted to do a family comedy with that point of view. And we said, yeah, we're interested. It was very, very late in the development season. But we were able to
Was there a
to put it
bidding
together.
war for that show? Or
Well, yeah. We said yes, and they began to look for the writers, put pieces together, but we weren't sure we could make a deal. And when it looked like we weren't going to make a deal, they went over to ABC and said, hey, this is what we have. NBC's interested, but, there's no deal. And ABC said, Bill Cosby, we don't know. And ultimately, we put a little more on the table. We closed the deal. And it changed the fortunes of NBC.
what was it like working with Bill and Marcy and Tom?
It was an incredible, wonderful experience. Ed Weinberger and Michael Leeson, literally at the last moment, all of our other development had been picked up, was moving forward. This was really late in the game. But Weinberger and Leeson wrote a script, a demo script. It wasn't even a full half-hour pilot. And Brandon and I got that script. We read it, and we looked at each other and we said, this is wonderful. It's really funny. I really feel like the parents have a strong role here. The kids have great voices. This really feels great. I said, I don't have any notes. I mean, I don't want to tell them to change something just because we're telling them. And Brandon said, you're absolutely right. For the first time in our lives, why don't we pick up the phone and tell the producers we have no notes? It's the only time I've ever done that.
What other things made it different to work on this show versus other shows at the time?
Well, because we were in such a rush, we did the casting, we did everything out here in California, and did just a little demo out here, and then the show moved back to New York where Bill lived, and the show was shot in Brooklyn, and we hadn't done any programs back in New York, so I would run back and forth to cover the show, and Bill's voice was so strong. Weinberger and Leeson, who had wrote a wonderful demo, they weren't attached to stay with the show. That never happens. New writers were brought in, and Bill didn't always agree with their vision. Everyone was smart enough to say, ultimately, the vision here is Bill Cosby. And Tom and Marcy just encouraged Bill. They gave Bill the freedom to do the show that he believed in. We supported him with a lot of young writers. A lot of writers were discovered on that show. And kind of the rules for doing television were thrown out. It was banking on the vision of Bill Cosby.
When did you start to feel like you had a tiger by the tail?
Well, when we screened that pilot, and the night of the demo taping was phenomenal. That felt like we were in great territory. I just said, oh my God, I think finally, in my years at NBC, we're going to have a hit show. And they delivered it. It was screened at NBC. It screened unbelievably well. People were cheering, clapping. It was a wonderful pilot. And the research was through the roof. We knew we had something.
So let's go back to a couple of the shows that were around before Cosby, and then we'll talk about Cosby's impact on those. Family Ties and Cheers both predated Cosby's launch, correct?
Yes.
So Family Ties, how did that show come about?
There was a pilot script, a 1-hour pilot script that Gary David Goldberg wrote for CBS. And and it was the Family Ties concept. It was parents who were hippies, who they were liberals, and they ended up with a completely conservative son. And they were scratching their heads trying to figure it out. In the 1-hour form, it just didn't have the dramatic weight. And Brandon looked at the script and shared it with me also. And Brandon said, I think it's a half hour, not an hour. And we met with Gary David Goldberg, and he was just thrilled because CBS had passed on it. He was thrilled for anybody to show interest in it. And we were fortunate in casting Michael J. Fox, and that show came to life. But it wasn't an immediate hit by any means. It was a relatable, fun family comedy. And it took a while for the Alex P. Keaton character to really, really hit it and take off. It also took a while for Gary Goldberg to figure out that the voice of the kids was really, they were strong, fun voices, and that's where the audience wanted to go with. But it was doing all right. We put it behind Facts of Life. It was moving around the schedule. It really took The Cosby Show to turn Family Ties into a massive hit. And we put Cosby at 8 o'clock on Thursday night and Family Ties right behind it.
And obviously we'll get into the whole Thursday night phenomenon that Cosby helped kick off. What was it like working with Gary David Goldberg and Michael J. Fox?
Well, Gary Goldberg was a passionate and really talented writer. Gary didn't want to take a lot of notes from the network. Gary's feeling was, I'll figure out what the show needs. I'll work it through. And I think our wisdom was understanding that he had the talent to do that. So sometimes we had to walk very carefully with Gary. But he lived that era. He understood the clash in the household of values. He was a parent. He really, really was personally involved in the dynamics of that show, and he absolutely found it. And he listened to his audience. That was shot in front of a live audience, and he listened very carefully to what the audience was telling him.
And Michael J. Fox?
Michael J. Fox was a prince to work with.
Were you involved in casting him?
I was. It was a memorable session. Brandon famously said, well, I don't know if this kid's ever going to end up on a lunchbox. It was less than a year later that Brandon was presented with a lunchbox by Michael J. Fox with his picture on it. And Michael just absolutely nailed the Alex P. Keaton role. He was brilliant in that role, and there was nothing that the network couldn't ask Michael to do. I mean, we didn't have a lot of success at that point, so we were asking our talent to deliver all kinds of extra duty and appearances and things, and Michael was sensational to work with. And then they had to start adjusting his production schedule because he was asked to do a movie called Back to the Future. And we were like, wow, he's going to do a movie and do our show at the same time? Again, to his credit, Gary Goldberg said, I can make this work. We have to do this for Michael. And simultaneously, the show was taking off, And then Michael J. Fox's career exploded with that hit movie.
Was it the two of them together that really gave the show a boost in the ratings?
It gave it an enormous boost, and with the help then of Bill Cosby exploding Thursday night at 8 o'clock and delivering that audience into Family Ties. Family Ties really, really had come into its own. And that was a hugely successful family hour from 8 to 9.
Before Cosby, one of the hallmarks of NBC was that you had to show a lot of patience. I mean, you had these great shows, but to keep them on the air really showed an incredible and an unusual amount of patience in television. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think one of the best examples of patience was Cheers. Cheers was something that we believed in. We didn't offer any smart, sophisticated adult television on NBC. And we looked at Cheers and we thought, this is great. It's funny. I'm rooting for Sam and Diane. This is what we had hoped, getting in business with the Charles brothers and Jimmy Burrows. This is what we hoped it would mean for NBC. And it was getting killed. It was getting killed in the ratings. Why would an audience come to NBC for that kind of entertainment when they'd never been to NBC before for that kind of entertainment? And as Brandon and I were worried about its future, Grant Tinker said to us, so do you have anything better? And we said, no. And he goes, well, then there's really no discussion about whether or not you're going to renew it. And Brandon correctly pointed out to Grant, we were the lowest rated series in all of network television. And Grant said, do you have anything better? And we said no. And he goes, end of discussion. And I think that kind of patience rewarded because, of course, Cheers was a great show. When Cosby went into Thursday night and opened the night for us, followed by Family Ties, Cheers at 9 o'clock, it was a blockbuster night. And we had T-shirts that we made up for the affiliates and handed them out at the affiliate convention that said, patience rewarded. And that really was the philosophy. As
Grant's?
Yeah, as Grant would say, first be best, then be first.
How was Cheers developed? I know you said that there was a 13-episode blind commitment to Charles Brothers and Jimmy Burrows, but was there an official pitch for Cheers? Did they?
There was a pitch, and it was a famously kind of a non-pitch, actually. One of the observations that the Charles Brothers made was they said, about the only young adult comedy that's on network television is Three's Company, John Ritter's show. And they said, that show's fine. But it seems to us there's a whole realm of television entertainment, romantic comedy, relationship comedy that the door is wide open for us. They really haven't covered everything with Three's Company. Of course, that was very, very silly and certainly a successful show, but they saw that it meant there was a wide open landscape. And we appreciated that observation. It was really kind of an interesting observation. And they talked about movies like His Girl Friday, and they really thought they could capture a Tracy Hepburn kind of energy and back and forth, male-female point of view where each one is just as strong as the other. And they loved the idea of a bar, just a bar in Boston. They had gone on a scouting trip, and They'd wandered into the Bull and Finch in Boston, and they just felt, yeah, this is a place we'd like to hang out. This is a place we'd like to go. And that was what they brought to Cheers. So the pitch was very, very simple. Not a lot fleshed out with the characters, not story, more of a feeling of what they wanted to capture. And we said yes.
Which was risky because that would mean 13.
The deal was they could write up to 2 scripts, and we had 13 on the air. 13 firm on the air, not write a little check and get out of the commitment. 13 on the air episodes. They wrote Cheers, and we read it, and we were smart enough to say, this is it. You don't have to pitch another show. You don't just, let's go do it.
And were you involved in the casting?
I was. And the interesting process in the casting was they got six actors to audition, and they paired them up. And we went over to a stage at Paramount, and they did a couple of scenes. And Ted Danson and Shelley Long were matched up together, and they were wonderful. They were really, really wonderful. But the other guy, who was also good, was Fred Dreyer. And Jimmy Burrows had managed to really coach Fred through a terrific audition. And a number of us went, boy, Fred Dreyer is kind of the Sam Malone character, isn't he? And Charles Brothers and Jimmy said, Fred's great. You should put him in a drama, but we don't think he can do this every week and handle the demands of being at the center of a comedy. And we listened.
What was your relationship like with Charles Brothers?
I was in awe of the Charles Brothers. One of the things that I'd never seen before with a showrunner is that previously showrunners would pitch a story, and then there'd be another story the next week and another story. And the Charles Brothers would step back, and they would have an entire arc for a season. And they'd say, here's where we're going to start the year with Sam and Diane. And here's what's going to happen. Here's the wedge that's going to be driven between the two of them. And here's where we begin. Here's a midpoint. And here's where we'll end. And in fact, there were wonderful individual episodes, but they knew where they were going. They had an arc. They had a connectiveness throughout the seasons. And no one had ever articulated that's how they were going to do their shows before. And the writers flourished in that environment. And we saw lots of young writing talent come up under their direction. And they were playing with a different set of rules, with a different set of standards, and we benefited from it.
Why do you think they weren't more prolific?
They devoted a number of years to Cheers. They lived it, they breathed it, and they brought in tremendous people who came up underneath them. And in success, they stepped back and said, we're happy with what we've done. Financially, we're going to do extremely well. And the Charles Brothers stepped back. Jimmy Burrows has never taken his foot off the accelerator.
Now, that's obviously a very significant relationship in that he directed many pilots for you over the years. Obviously, was Cheers the first professional experience you had with him?
Yeah, Cheers was the first experience I had with Jimmy. And again, it was just an incredible education watching Jimmy work, seeing what Jimmy gets out of the actors on stage, but also seeing what Jimmy gets out of the writers. Jimmy directs the writing staff as well as the actors. And the explosion that happens between the two of them is great entertainment.
Is that a function of coming from being Abe's son, do you think?
Well, certainly Jimmy grew up watching Abe Burrows work as a writer and producer of some of the greatest Broadway plays ever produced. And Jimmy has just great instincts for story, a great sense of the moment, jokes, and he gets both sides, both the acting pool and the writing pool. He just helps bridge the gap between them. Both sides feel empowered, and Jimmy understands how to get the best out of both of them.
The show, as you mentioned, was at the bottom of the ratings in its first year. Do you think that was a function of the show or a function of the environment on NBC at the time? Meaning there wasn't a lot of circulation, NBC was low rated, it was tough to find.
NBC didn't have a lot of circulation. We didn't have tentpole shows. So, and by the way, why come to NBC for a sophisticated comedy? CBS had great adult comedies, so did ABC. They had real diversity. ABC had 12, 14 comedies on their schedules. CBS had a dozen, award-winning, both of them. NBC just didn't have the guns. So it took time. And Cheers was this wonderful little spark. And we had to figure out how to ignite that and be smart enough that
keep it alive.
Just keep it alive, exactly. So thank God we did. And then a Cosby comes along, and Cosby changes the face of NBC. Cosby turns on the lights on Thursday night. We were getting killed against Magnum PI and Simon and Simon. So Bill Cosby leads off the night, Family Ties, Cheers. Then we had Night Court behind it, another pilot directed by Jimmy Burrows. And a writer who had come up, Reinhold Wigge, who had come up working with Danny Arnold on Barney Miller. And the home for Hill Street Blues on Thursday night at 10 o'clock. That's where that show played. And then the next show to transition in there to 10 o'clock was L.A. Law. So Thursday night became a night of bests for NBC. Kind of the best comedy, the best drama that we could offer as a network. Thursday became, in the 80s, kind of a destination for the best we had.
Before we leave Cheers, let's talk about you. You were obviously very involved day to day. You were involved in development. You stayed involved day to day, and there were a number of major transitions in that show over the years. I mean, you had Nick Colasanto's death, Woody Harrelson, the importance of finding somebody to replace him. You had the Shelley Long and Kirstie Alley transition. Can you talk about the transitions on Cheers?
Well, Nick Colasanto, no one knew it, but when Nick first took the role, he was severely ill, and yet he was the guy everyone fell in love with, and it was really hard to imagine replacing him, but we had to. And the Charles brothers, there was a wonderful sense of that delightfully absent-minded, not completely there coach character that Sam Malone loved. And they decided just to keep some of the well, the light's not fully on. It's a low wattage bulb. with Woody, and yet a young, fresh face, a completely different generation. Maybe part of it was a tribute to Coach, to Nick, not to compete in any way. And yet, Woody Harrelson comes in to play Woody Boyd, and he was delightful. And it brought a new level of energy and fun to the show. We didn't want that to happen, but it was a brilliant piece of casting that only added to the fun of that ensemble. And then Shelley Long, after doing 5 years at Cheers, and Shelley was Sam and Diane were the core of that show. And Shelley wanted to pursue a feature career, and her contract was up, and we were scared to death. And yet, we weren't going to give up on the show just because she was leaving. And Kirstie Alley comes in. Very, very different sensibility. And I was there for that first night of shooting with Kirstie Alley. And we were biting our nails, wondering, would this work? But she just had a strength and a go for it. She was in Sam's face, and then she also had this, at the same time, this vulnerability. As strong as she was, you realize that she had to be strong because she was kind of in a man's world, and there was something underneath that, and the audience loved her. The cast loved her. And we didn't have cell phones then, so I ran to a payphone and called Brandon and just said, you have no worries. Like, Kirstie Alley, this is going to work. And I think the wonderful tribute to Cheers and to Kirstie is the show went 11 years. So one more year with Kirstie than we had with Shelley. And it became the ensemble show. It wasn't as memorable as the Sam and Diane core had been. Cheers became a wonderful ensemble comedy where everybody stepped up. And let's not forget that the Frasier Crane character also became very prominent.
Cheers was certainly the first time in the modern television era where high production costs and actors' salaries, and that started to get more publicity, and public started to be more aware of that. What kind of, what did you think about that, and how do you think that impacted television into the future?
Well, I remember USA Today. There'd be little boxes in USA Today, and their life section. The world started reporting on things that were much more secretive. My mother knew more of what was going on behind the scenes, from the TV Guide articles to USA Today to some of the other entertainment rags. There seemed to be a fascination with behind the scenes of what was going on with these shows just as much as the product that we were putting out. The world was changing. And I think once that toothpaste was out of the tube, there was no putting it back.
What's the legacy of Cheers, and how do you feel like you personally contributed to that legacy?
Well, I think one of the greatest legacies of Cheers is it was a beacon for NBC in the 80s. But it also, when I finally had gotten a shot to be president of the entertainment division of NBC in the 90s, I looked back at Cheers and I said, that's our DNA. That smart, sophisticated adult comedy, that award-winning comedy, that's who we are. And I don't want to let go of that. while we had to say goodbye to Cheers after 11 years, we didn't have to say goodbye to that brand of quality adult comedy. And Seinfeld was able to step in, and they delivered in their own way, with their own sensibility, an equally unique, smart, outrageously funny adult comedy. And Mad About You also did that. And of course, we can go all the way forward to shows like Will and Grace, but I think they all owe a tip of the hat to Cheers. It was Cheers that educated us as broadcasters as to the value of that show. And we were proud to put Cheers on, but also it is a business, and advertisers went, we have to have it. We have to have Cheers. Cheers became the first comedy to have a 50-50 split of adult men and women both coming to that show. Previously, most comedies were dominated by the female audience. But getting an equal split of men and women made Cheers a very, very saleable commodity. And that wasn't lost on us either.
And being on Thursday night, which was extremely important to advertisers.
Thursday night was a night where, before audiences raced around and enjoyed their weekends, before big movies opened on Friday, the last chance to get your message out there, a shot at introducing a new product, a movie, right? You had to go to NBC, and you had to advertise on Thursday night on NBC to speak to the American public. And being associated with the best of NBC on Thursday night, for an advertiser, they had to have it.
So the original Thursday night 4 comedy lineup of Cosby, Family Ties, Cheers, Night Court, that was really, Cosby ignited that whole night, elevated the ratings for Family Ties and Cheers. Was that really Cosby, part of the Cosby legacy? How else would you define it?
Well, I think the Cosby legacy is certainly defined by a quality family comedy.
An African-American family.
Well, the first and foremost, they illuminated what was it really like today to love your children, to respect them, and battle with them. And you hadn't seen that kind of sensibility. And then also, yes, it was an African-American family where Dad was a doctor and Mom was a lawyer. And guess what? Just because they were successful didn't mean there weren't tons of problems to work out and to navigate in that household. Again, that was fresh, that was new. And storytelling became fresh and different because they were stories that Bill had lived. They came from Bill's life. And we freaked out when we initially heard that the second episode was going to be about Rudy's goldfish died. And they were going to flush it down the toilet. Well, wait a second. The goldfish dies really early in the show, right? And to flush or not to flush, that is the dilemma? Well, you know what? Bill understood because he lived that story. And he understood where the humor would come from and where the heart would come from. And it broke all the rules, and it was sensational. And so Bill and Marcy and Tom, with that show, they taught us a lot. And America rewarded them as being the #1